Okay, so this video will be basically an explanation how the British Parliamentary debating format works. So basically, this video is going on the assumption that you are already familiar with the Asian Parliamentary debates, the basic the 3-on-3 debates. If you are already aware of that format, if you're already familiar with that format, then it will be easier for you to understand the British Parliamentary format. Okay, right. Okay, so let's start. Now, first of all, you have the Asian Parliamentary Debating Format, or APD for short, or you have WSD, World School Debating Format. Both are very much similar. Basically, three people going against three. You have the first speaker, second speaker, and the whip speaker, and you get a reply speech. Basically, it's a government versus opposition. It's a matter of whether the motion stays or motion falls. Whether the House should pass the motion or reject the motion. That's basically what the debate is about. Asian Parliamentary and World Schooling very similar. Only like a couple of differences are there in terms of terms and all. Very few changes in APD and World School. Pretty much the same thing. Not huge changes, huge differences. Unlike British parliamentary. So if you're already familiar with Asian parliamentary debates and world school debates, this is what it's about. Basically, it's a debate between the government and the opposition. Government versus opposition, 3-on-3. The government gets 3 speeches plus the reply speech. Opposition gets 3 speeches plus the reply speech. And basically, it's a matter of whether the motion stays or falls. And the concern of the adjudicators is to determine whether the motion stays or falls. If the government wins, the motion stays. If the opposition wins, motion falls. I believe that you are already aware of that. And basically, the key word here is that Asian Parliamentary debate or a World School debate, it's basically 2 teams. One team goes government, one team goes opposition. 3 speakers versus 3 speakers. Pretty clear, right? And when we move on to British Parliamentary debates, first of all, it is still a battle between the government and the opposition, yes. Here, however, you have 4 debaters going against 4 debaters. There are no reply speeches. Basically, 4 debaters challenging other 4 debates. Basically, there are 8 people involved in the debate, 4 for the government side, 4 for the opposition side. And yes, technically, it is a matter of it's a debate where to keep the motion or like reject the motion. Basically, it is a debate. The government says the motion should stay. Opposition says the government. Opposition says the government is wrong and the motion should fall. However, when it comes to the adjudicators, their concern is who did their job the best, right? Rather than determining whether the motion stays or falls. In fact, in a British parliamentary debate, the adjudicators don't even have to say whether the motion stays or falls. It is a matter of determining who did their job the best, right? So the key difference here is that there are 4 teams, in fact. So these 8 debaters coming to debate, they represent 4 different teams. So the government has 2 parts called the opening government and the closing government. Opposition has 2 parts called the opening opposition and closing opposition. We shall get to that in a bit. So basically, this is still a matter of 2 teams going as the government and 2 teams going as the opposition. Right? That's how you get the 8 people. There are 2 debaters in each team, right? So the debate goes, for someone who watches the debate without having any idea about this format, it appears as if basically just like an Asian parliamentary debate where 3 people debate against 3 people, government versus opposition. This appears the same. The only difference is you have 1 extra speaker, 4 versus 4. However, for the adjudicators, it's a matter of deciding whether who did their job the best. So I'll explain this further in a bit. In a nutshell, basically whether the first part of the government did their job the best or the second part of the government did their. That means whether the first 2 speakers of the government did bring in good constructive arguments, whether the first 2 speakers of the opposition bring in good constructive arguments, whether the third and fourth speakers of the government properly handle the rebuttals and clash points, or whether the third or fourth speakers of the opposition handle the rebuttals or clash points the best, right? So it's a matter of seeing whether who did their job the best. It's a matter of ranking them, okay? So if it is a little confusing at the moment, don't worry, we shall get into it like this. Okay, so basically this is the format. Government, also known as proposition, right, has two parts: opening government, closing government. As you can see here, you have opening government here and you have closing government here. And this side, you can see there's opening opposition and there's closing opposition. All right. So when it comes to the speaker roles, opening parts pretty much it sounds very much the same. Opening government has the prime minister and the deputy prime minister. Opening opposition has the leader of opposition and the deputy leader of opposition, right? When it comes to the closing part, only this is a little different from the Asian format, because other than the government whip and the opposition whip, government whip and the opposition whip, they are the ones who go last. Other than that, you have the member of the government and the member of the opposition. So this is how it goes. So if I basically explain, in a normal Asian parliamentary format debate, what happens is Prime Minister brings in constructives, Deputy Prime Minister handles some rebuttals, and brings in like some constructives as well, and the whip basically handles rebuttals and clash points. Same goes to the opposition, right? So here we consider this like, you know, when you do parliamentary debates, basically like it's a pretend parliament, that you sort of pretend it's a parliament and you sort of pretend that the adjudicators are like adjudicator, the chair adjudicator is the speaker, which is why you address them as honorable speaker, right? So here it's a matter of considering the opening government as senior members of the government and closing government as the junior members, like the back row members. If you see in a parliament, you see that all the seniors sit in the front row. Normally, prime minister, deputy prime minister, those positions are given to seniors, right? Even in the opposition, leader opposition, deputy opposition leader, these people, they sit in the front, right? These are the back row people. Member of opposition, that means this person is a junior member of the government. This person is a junior member of the opposition. I'm just explaining to you how this sort of like works with a practical parliament. Okay, that's not very important. Basically, it's a matter of these two doing the constructive work for the government, these two doing the constructive work for the opposition, these two doing the rebutting and clash point work for the government, these two doing the rebutting and clash point business for the opposition, right? So when it comes to an adjudicator, it's a matter of seeing who did their job the best. When you sort of compare all these four teams, do you feel like, as an adjudicator, do you feel like the opening government brought in really excellent constructive arguments? And if you felt like for the government side, the third and fourth speakers didn't really handle the rebuttals well and their clash points were all over the place, which means that opening government would be scored higher, closing government would be scored less, right? Same goes to the opposition. Maybe in the opposition, it would be the other way around. You felt like the closing opposition handled their rebuttals and clash points extremely well, although the opening opposition didn't do that well. The opening opposition didn't do a good job establishing their constructive arguments, neither addressing the main points brought up by the government, right? So in that case, you feel like the closing opposition should be scored higher than the opening opposition. And in the end, it's a matter of putting all the four scores together and deciding who has the highest, who has the second highest, then the third, then the fourth. So it's a race between four teams. Okay. So I'll just explain this with an example. Okay. Now imagine these four teams. Now, in a Asian parliamentary debating, APD or World School, you have two teams. Like, if you are going as a certain team, that that you are going against another team. So it's a matter of there's a winner and there's a loser. In this case, it's not the case. There are four teams going at each other, and this is basically a race. This is not a duel. This is not a duel. Two teams fight with each other. This is a race that you put four teams together to see which one comes first. Okay. So imagine that there is a debate: France versus Great Britain versus Australia versus USA. Okay. Great Britain or United Kingdom, whatever you prefer to say. Okay. So imagine these four teams are running. So what's the first thing? First things first, the organizing committee or the judges will have to put a draw to see who goes in what position. Now, this is a little bit of too much work, because in Asian Parliamentary World Schooling, it's a matter of putting the draw and deciding who's going gov, who's going op, or who's going prop, who's going op. Here, little too much work, because you have to figure out who goes opening government, who goes closing government, who goes opening opposition, who goes closing opposition, right? So imagine it came like this. Okay, USA gets to go opening government, opposition, opening opposition. Australia gets to go opening opposition. France gets to go closing government. Britain gets to go closing opposition. Okay. Now, when the debate starts, when the first speaker for US, right, when the first American speaker takes the podium, right, takes the floor, they also get like 7-minute speeches. I haven't seen them speaking for 8 minutes. It's ideally 7 minutes, right? So you get 7 minutes to speak. And basically, this is similar to any other first speaker, any other PM speech, right? Not much of a difference at all. You basically have to define the key terms. If it's like this house would, what do you call that, motion, that you might need to have like some sort of a framework, and you sort of need to establish two constructive arguments, right? Two constructive arguments. Okay, so not much of a difference if you're going as the opening government, and especially if you're going as the first speaker. Your role is very much similar to what you do in an Asian parliamentary debate, right? Then you go as then the first speaker from Australia has to go. The leader of opposition has to go, and again that is very similar to what you do in an Asian Parliament debate if you're going as the first speaker of the opposition, but slightly different, because you need to sort of attack the Prime Minister's points a little aggressively. Because if it's a normal Asian parliamentary debate, you have two speakers to follow you, right? You have two speakers to follow you. So even if you miss like an important point, you have two more speakers to handle that. If your second speaker misses that, your whip can handle that point. In this matter, you have actually three more speakers to follow you, but only one member from your own team, right? So as an opposition, yes, you have three more teammates, but in reality, you only have one teammate in the actual race, in the actual when they choose the actual winner of the debate. So you can't leave too much for your deputy leader of opposition, right? Because if he misses something, that will be handled by the closing opposition people, and that point will go to them for addressing that particular argument. Okay, hope you understood that part. Then only two. They also can come up with two constructive arguments. Okay. Now here comes the interesting part. This way it starts getting different. If you're going as a second speaker for the government, now normally in our debates, in our Asian parliamentary debates or world school debates, how many arguments normally do you go with? If you're going as the government or the opposition, you normally go with three main arguments. That's like the way you normally approach a debate. Your first speaker handles two arguments, and the third argument is normally handled by the second speaker. All right. But in these debates, you don't do that. You don't, when you are going as a second speaker, if you're going as a DPM or the DLO, you don't go for a third argument, which is because you need to rebut what the other people say, because you don't have a third speaker to specifically handle rebuttals here. You have a third speaker, but you can't leave any points for that the third speaker, because then those points would go to the closing government opposition and not to your side. So you need to rebut as much as you can. So if you are going as a DPM, your job is basically rebutting what the leader of opposition said. Whatever the key points brought up by the leader of opposition, you need to rebut those, because if you leave anything, the member of the government, the third speaker, or the government whip will rebut those, and you are not going to get those points. Those points will be going to the closing government side. So you need to handle the rebuttals as much as you can. Other than that, rather than bringing in a whole new argument, right? Because you necessarily don't have to bring in a new argument and what do you call that? Establish it. What you can do is, if you have a couple of minutes, you can further elaborate the two arguments brought up by your PM, right? You can further elaborate what your first speaker brought up. All right. Then we move on to the deputy leader of opposition, second speaker of the opposition. Again, now you have two people to handle. You have the prime minister and you have the deputy prime minister. Two of the government people have spoken, and as the second speaker of the opposition, you need to make sure that you rebut all the key points brought up by both these speakers. Okay, because if you leave anything, those will be rebutted by the member of the opposition or the opposition whip, and you are going to lose those points. You're not going to get those points. So you need to make sure that you rebut all those points and you take the marks that are allocated for those rebuttals to your team. Okay, and also you don't bring in a third argument as the opposition second speaker. Instead, what you can do is you can use a minute or two to further elaborate, further establish whatever the arguments brought up by your opposition leader, your first speaker. All right. Then we move on to the third speaker of the government, which is the member of the government. We are moving to the junior section now. Okay. Then what does this person have to do? Now, as I told you that if you are going as the opening government, you don't establish three arguments. You only establish two. Okay. And now they have the opportunity to bring in a third argument, right? You can bring in a third argument. If you are going as the member of the government, if you are going as the third speaker of the government, you can bring in a third argument, not the two arguments brought up by the opening government people, not the two arguments mentioned by the prime minister. So while listening to the PM and DPM speaking, you need to note down whatever the arguments they wrote, whatever the arguments they said, and you need to think of a third argument that you can come up with. So basically, you do that during your prep time, right? If you're smart, you can actually assume what would be the two main arguments the PM is going to say, right? So you can assume, okay, they are not going to mention this one. They will go with these two. So most probably I will have to bring in the third argument. So that comes with your skill and your experience, right? So you, ideally speaking, you need to listen to the PM speaking and bring in a different argument. But if you're smart enough, the prep time you get, during the prep time, you can actually assume what they would say. And one more side note, perhaps some of you all must be having this question right now. Prep time is given to 4 teams separately. Yeah? 4 teams have to prep separately. So if you are opening government, if you are closing government, you don't know what the opening government is prepping about. You will get to know what their content is when you start the debate. Okay. So the first thing, the member of the government, the third speaker of the government, as a closing government, the first thing you can do is bringing in the third argument. Okay. So if the opening government has not brought in a very key argument, right? Imagine the opening government should have gone with one of the very basic key arguments that if you wanted this motion to stay, there could have been a definite argument that they definitely should have used. But They did not bring that argument. And the closing government brings in as their third argument, which means that they are going to get points. They are going to get marks for bringing in that very important argument. So because of that, if you are going as opening government, you need to make sure that you bring in the all basic arguments, all the fundamental, most important arguments you bring in. Because if you miss out an important point and the closing government brings that in, closing government is going to get that point. Okay. So if the opening government has brought in the all important points, if they've already done it, closing government has to go with like a third argument, um, which is also important, but that is ideally the third argument, right? So if the opening government was good, that means they won't leave out a key argument to be brought up by the closing government. That means they will have to go with ideally what would have been their third argument. Okay. So first thing the third speaker of the government can do is bringing in the third argument, a new argument which wasn't brought up by the opening government. Secondly, they can go for extensions. This is important. Extensions are important. Extensions means that you need to extend, further elaborate what your opening government speaker said. So basically, if they analyzed a certain argument, you need to go for the second level of analysis. If the government had two levels of analysis, you need to go for a third level of analysis, right? So that's the second thing that you get to do. Okay, and you can rebut the points brought up by the DLO, right? Now, the government, the opening government would not be penalized for not rebutting something brought up by the second speaker of the opposition, because the second speaker of the opposition gets to speak when the opening government is done with their speeches, right? So it's all right, but if the opening government hasn't rebutted something mentioned by the leader of opposition, then that is a problem. Then you get penalized for that, right? If that was rebutted by the third speaker of the government, that means the opening government had the opportunity, but they didn't take it. I was taken by the closing government. In that case, they will be penalized, right? But anything brought up by the DLO, yes, opening government won't be penalized for that, because by the time DLO spoke, the first two speakers were done, right? So the member of the government, the third speaker, or the government whip will have to handle what the DLO came up with. Okay, so you need to rebut those points. Okay, so I think now it is obvious that the adjudicators really need to pay attention to see which points were brought up by which speaker. You know, in Asian parliamentary debates also, when as you do that, you sort of like note down who specifically said this. But here it's very crucial, right? Because there can be something mentioned by the opening opposition, you need to be specific whether it was brought up by the leader of opposition or the deputy leader. Because it was brought up by the leader of opposition, the DPM should have rebutted that, right? If the point was brought up by the DLO, yes, opening government didn't have a chance. That means it's up to the closing government. All right, I think I'm clear here. Then we move on to the member of the opposition, third speaker of the opposition. Okay. And as obviously what you can do is, first of all, you can bring in a third argument for your opposition side, something wasn't mentioned by the first speaker of the opposition, like because they only came up with two arguments, you need to bring in a third argument. And you can go for extensions. You can extend what the first two speakers said, already established arguments, and you get to rebut. Now you have three people who have spoken already from the government side, right? You can rebut something brought up by the member of the government, the third speaker of the government. For that, you get like normal points for that, because the opening opposition don't get a chance to speak again. So whatever the third speaker of the government says, opening opposition don't get to address those. So those arguments are all yours. So you get marks if you rebut those. But you actually get marks, you actually get to steal marks from your opening opposition if you rebut something that was mentioned by the PM or the DPM, right? So the leader of the opposition got the chance to rebut, because they got to go after the opening government. And if they haven't rebutted some key points and the member of the opposition rebuts those points, and they get to steal those points from the opening opposition. Especially you need to be penalized, especially the opening opposition would be penalized if the third speaker of the opposition rebuts something that was mentioned by the PM, the Prime Minister, because the opening opposition already had two speeches to rebut those points, and if those points still stay. Okay. Now keep in mind, this can be tricky, right? Because you can rebut an already rebutted point. Maybe the opening opposition also rebutted what PM said, and the closing opposition also goes and rebut the same point. In that case, you just need to see, you just need to check uh, which rebuttal is stronger. Okay. Now imagine something like this. Imagine PM comes up with a certain argument as equality, right? And let's say the leader of opposition or DLO rebuts that equality. Let's say a reasonably good rebuttal. But then the member of opposition, the third speaker, also rebuts that. But this time they rebut it better, a stronger rebuttal, right? So although the closing opposition had a stronger rebuttal, that doesn't mean that the opening opposition was being ignorant. They did not neglect rebutting that point. They also rebutted. It's just a matter that the closing opposition had a better rebuttal. In that case, you should mark the opening opposition higher rather than penalizing the opening opposition for that. Okay, I hope I'm making myself clear. But there can be a situation where the opening government's case was mainly like founded on the argument of equality, but the leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition both completely neglected rebutting that, and it was finally rebutted by the third speaker of the opposition. In that case, the closing opposition should get points for rebutting that, as well as the opening opposition should be penalized for avoiding that fact. Okay. So it's different when an argument goes completely unrebutted, or when it is like weakly rebutted. So if the leader opposition and the deputy opposition leader did rebut that somehow, you shouldn't penalize them, right? If a certain point was rebutted by the opening and closing both of a side, like let's say opening opposition, closing opposition, both rebutted the same point brought up by the government. In that case, you should mark the stronger rebuttal higher, and you should give that weaker rebuttal like a lesser mark, right? But if they neglected to rebut that, if the opening opposition neglected rebutting that, they should be penalized for that, right? Okay, I think you understand why this debating format is uh, much more complex, and it requires a lot of brain, especially even for debaters as well as for the adjudicators. Okay, right. Then we move on to the government whip. So when it comes to government whip, of course, again, now it's very much the same. If you are going as the last, it's very similar to what you would normally do in an Asian Parliament debate if you are going as a whip speaker. All right. So you need to, you can't bring in new content. That's number one. You can't bring in new content, and you have to rebut the existing points. You have to rebut whatever the remaining points. Now, if you are going as government whip, three people of the opposition have spoken. And if there are any points that are still remaining unrebutted, you can rebut those. If as a government whip, if you rebut something that was mentioned by the member of the opposition, that you get normal marks. Even if you rebut something was mentioned by the deputy leader of opposition, you get normal marks, because the opening government had no chance of addressing those. Whatever the DLO said, whatever the member of the opposition said, the opening government didn't get to speak after those speeches, so you get normal marks. But if you rebut something that was mentioned by the leader of opposition, you get extra marks, because those points were not addressed by the deputy prime minister. Okay, the opening government missed rebutting those points, and you managed to rebut those points. So that's how the rebuttal should work, and you are not allowed to bring in any new content, given the fact that ideally this is the last speech for the government, right? And there are no reply speeches also. So technically you are closing the case for the government, so you can't bring in new content at all. Okay. and you need to identify the clash points, right? So when you identify clash points, you need to act a little smarter, right? So first of all, you need to show as a government, we want this clash, right? But when analyzing the clash points, you need to sort of show that you need to emphasize on the points that were brought up by the closing government, right? When you analyze a clash point, you can say, okay, first of all, I saw the clash point between equality and development, or let's say rights versus development. I saw these clash points of rights versus development. So as a government, we said rights were important. As opposition, they were saying development was important. But as a government, we proved it to you, dear speaker, that rights actually are more important than development. So when you explain how the government won that clash, you sort of need to put more weight in to the points that were mentioned by your teammate, right? You need to show that we won that clash because of the content the third speaker brought in. You need to emphasize on those more, right? Same goes to the opposition, right? If you are going as the opposition whip, bringing in new content is strictly prohibited, because like this is the eighth speech of the debate, right? 7 people have spoken already, and you are basically concluding the debate. No one gets to speak after that, no replies. So no new content at all. And you can rebut whatever the existing points, and if you rebut something that was brought up by the prime minister that wasn't rebutted throughout the debate, you should be given like very much like a lot of points, because again, as I said, like you had basically 3 speeches before that like should be rebutted for the opposition side, right? If the opposition whip rebut something brought up by the closing government, they get normal points. But if they rebut something that was brought up by the opening government, you get more points, because rebutting those points were neglected by the opening opposition. Especially, as I said, if it was something brought up by the prime minister, the opening opposition had 2 speeches to rebut that, and they missed it. It was finally rebutted by the opposition whip. That means that opening opposition should be penalized for that. Basically, PM brought in something and they had 2 speeches, they completely avoided that. They should be penalized for that, right? And of course, again, going to the clash points, you need to identify the clash points and show that why the opposition wants certain clashes. While explaining the clashes, you need to sort of like put weight to whatever the member of the opposition said, rather than what the LO and the DLO said, and show that this is why this clash should go to the opposition. All right. So that's a basic explanation. Couple of important things. First of all, as I said, throughout the debate, you can't emphasize the difference between the difference between opening government and closing government, right? So as I said, for someone who watches the debate without having any idea about like this format, they should feel like this is basically 4 people versus 4 people normal debate. The government has to act as a single government to keep the motion, like to make sure the motion stays, and the opposition, the 4 people have to work together to make sure that the motion falls. Okay, which is why I said like the whip speaker has to identify clashes from the whole debate, right? The government whip don't say that as the closing government, we showed it to you, never mention the word as the opening government, we are here to present, as the closing government, we are here to present, as the closing opposition, I am here to oppose it. You never say that. You basically say, as the government, we are here. As the opposition, we are here, right? As a government, we like to ask the speaker to side government. That's what you say. You don't mention the word opening government, closing government in the debate, right? So it's a matter of working together, but in the meantime, outshining your team members. If you are the opening government, your prior purpose is making sure the motion stays. But in the meantime, you need to convince the judges the motion stays because of our work, right? At the end of the debate, that's what matters, right? So maybe the motion falls, right? Maybe the motion falls. But if the opening government did their job to show why the motion should stay, it doesn't matter whether the motion stays or falls, and the opening government should come first, because they did the constructive work and they did rebut whatever the points brought up by the leader of opposition, and they brought in all the key points. So because of that, they should be first, right? Or maybe the closing opposition did their job well, right? maybe the motion stays, right? Maybe after all, when you listen to the debate, you feel like the motion should stay, but that is not the concern of the judges, right? That's not the concern of the adjudicators. If you feel like the closing opposition did a fantastic job rebutting all the points brought up by the opening and closing government both, right? And if they identify the clash points really well, they should be ranked highest, despite whether the motion falls or stays, right? In fact, the adjudicators don't even have to mention whether the motion stays or falls, right? You just have to write down the marks for each speaker, and finally add and see what team came first, what team came second, who came third, who came fourth, right? But although when you go as a government, you go as a government. You don't call yourselves opening government or closing government, right? So you speak, I am the first speaker for the government. You be like, I am the third speaker for the government. You don't say, I am speaking for the closing government. You don't say that. That's up to the adjudicators to identify that this is the closing government and mark them separately. Okay. So then the next point is that you can rebut points brought up by any, right? If you are going as the closing government, you have points brought up by the opening opposition, closing opposition. You can equally attack them, not a problem, right? So when it comes to the debate, keep in mind, if you are going as a closing government, it doesn't mean that you have three opposing teams, right? Technically, you have only one opposing team, which is the opposition. If you are going as the opening opposition, doesn't mean that you are in a battle with like three different teams. In reality, yes, but in the debate, you are the opposition and your rivals are the government, right? You don't even have to acknowledge that these are like what do you call that? These are like two different teams that are sitting in front of me. You just have to keep in mind this is the government. You need to consider four speakers as a government, and you can rebut any point brought up by anyone. Okay. In reality, it's a battle between, like, it's a race between four different teams. Okay. So if you are going as a closing government or closing opposition, a really important point, this is a really important point. If you are going as a closing government or the closing opposition, you can't rebut something that was mentioned by your own team, right? If you are going as a closing government, even if the opening government has brought in like a really stupid argument, right? You should not talk about that argument in a negative way, right? Imagine you are going as a third speaker for the government. That means like you are going as a member of the government. And imagine both points brought up by the government, opening government, were like completely ridiculous, really weak, bad arguments, right? You do not start your speech by saying that these points are like invalid or anything. You don't say anything negative about the points brought up by your opening side, opening members. Okay, that's called knifing. It's like knifing, like you stab your teammates with a knife. It's like something like that. You call that knifing, and you lose marks for that. Okay, even if your opening people have brought in really bad arguments, and if you point that out that these arguments are bad in your speech, you get penalized for that. That's called knifing. You're not supposed to do that. If the arguments were weak, either you can completely avoid extending those arguments and construct your argument, because you are supposed to bring in one new argument to the debate. So you can bring in a strong argument in that case. Okay. Or else you can rephrase those arguments and do like a second level of analysis, which would actually make sense. But if the arguments are like completely bad, completely horrible arguments that, in no way that would fit the debate, you can completely avoid those and go ahead with your arguments, and you can rebut the other side's points. Okay. So you should not knife your own team members, right? POIs, you can't ask POIs from your own opening part or your own closing part, right? But you are allowed to ask POIs from any of the four speakers who are sitting in front of you. If you are going as the government whip, you can ask POIs from DLO, LO, member of opposition whip, anyone, all four, right? Same goes to all the speakers, right? So most likely that you get more POIs. When you're speaking, most likely that you get a lot of POIs because that instead of 3 opponents, you are facing 4 opponents, technically, right? And especially when you're speaking, you can take 2 POIs. It's sort of like recommended you take 2 POIs from 2 sides, right? I mean, if you took 1 POI from the government, let's say that you are the DLO speaking. If you are the DLO speaking, and let's say you took 1 POI from government whip, right? You can take the next POI from the DPM because you already took 1 POI from the closing government. It's not a rule that you can take any POI you want. You can not take POIs if you don't want. You can take 2 POIs from the same team. You can take 2 POIs from the closing government itself. That's not compulsory, but normally what people do is they take 2 POIs from 2 sides just to balance things out, right? And judges should keep track of which POI was asked by which team, right? Because imagine something like this. Imagine that when the leader of opposition speaks, the government whip asks a POI, okay? And the leader of opposition answers that. And let's say that that POI government whip asked really damaged, really had an impact on leader of opposition speech, right? And let's say that was capitalized by the DPM. So the DPM had a good rebuttal on LO because of that POI asked by the government whip. So rather than giving all the credit to the DPM for that rebuttal, you need to avoid at least 1 or 2 points for the government whip for asking that POI, right? So it's like that. Asking POIs are like that. And you can't knife your own teammates. Okay. Other than that, yeah, there are no reply speeches. Same rules apply. First minute and the last minute are guarded minutes. You can go with 7-minute speeches or 8-minute speeches. Ideally, it's 7 minutes as usual. And normally it takes a little more time than normal debates because the reply speeches in Asian Parliament goes for 4 minutes. But here you have like 4 7-minute speeches or 4 8-minute speeches from one side. So that takes some time. And the judges should basically keep track on. Basically, judges will have to be very vigilant to keep an eye on what point was brought up by which team, what rebuttal was handled by which team, which POI was asked by which team, and etc. Right? So basically, you have to be clear with every line that was mentioned in the debate. Because in Asian Parliament, it's a matter of like jotting down the government came up and said this. Here, you need to be clear whether it was the opening government or the closing government, right? And in some cases, it matters whether it was a DPM or the PM. If it was like opening government said that, and it was rebutted by the closing opposition, right? Imagine there's a point that was brought up by the opening government. You jot down it was brought up by the opening government, and it was rebutted by the closing opposition first speaker, like who the member of the government, the third speaker for the opposition, right? So you need to be sure whether it was brought up by the PM or the DPM, because if it was something brought up by the DPM, only closing opposition should get points for that, or opening opposition should not be penalized because they didn't have a chance to rebut that. If it was something brought up by the PM, the opening opposition should be penalized for that because they had a chance to rebut and they did not. Okay. All right. Speaking of which, we need to sort of like move on to how the judging works. I think I pretty much explained how the judges should keep in track and how the giving points should come. So basically giving the verdict is something that you need to be a little clear of. Now, first of all, since there are 4 teams involved in this, of course, the verdict doesn't go as motion stays, motion falls, and there's no winner and a loser, right? Basically, you have a first place, second place, third place, and a fourth place. It's a ranking system you go. Okay. So if you go with the previous one, imagine in this case, the judges feel like, let's say, the opening government did not do that much of a job. They missed some important points, which were later brought up by the closing government. And the opening government did not rebut the points brought up by the leader of opposition. Like some of them were actually rebutted by the member of government and the government whip. So let's say the opening government didn't really do a good job. Okay. Then imagine the leader of the closing opposition. Imagine the closing opposition was somewhat better, that they did bring in good arguments and as opposition, and they did rebut whatever the key points brought up by the opening government. And that's another thing that you need to be clear with. Now imagine if the opening government does not bring in good arguments. So because of that, the opening opposition did not have a lot of good points to rebut, right? So in that case, you should keep in mind that it's not opening opposition's fault that their rebuttals were not like very fiery, because that's the fault of the opening government. They did not give good points for these guys to rebut, right? So that's something you need to keep in mind as a judge. But imagine, but whatever the arguments that came their way, opening opposition did a good job rebutting those, although they were not fiery. They were sufficient enough. They were not fiery because the arguments weren't that solid. Okay, and imagine that they did rebut whatever brought up by the PM and the DPM, and they did bring in good constructive arguments for the opposition side. Let's say that they did well, and let's say the closing government did an okay job, because although the opening government did not bring in good arguments, the closing government gave good extensions. They did bring in a good third argument, and the government whip identify the clashes. Okay. And let's say the closing opposition did bad. Closing opposition did not extend whatever the arguments brought up by their opening opposition people. They did not bring in a good third argument, and their clash points and everything were all over the place. Right? In that case, we can say the closing opposition did not do their job as the closing opposition. Rebuttals weren't handled properly. Their own constructive, they did not take them forward. So in that case, the closing opposition should be ranked fourth. Okay. And since the opening government also didn't do that much of a good job, but they weren't bad as the closing government, they did bring in some good arguments and all that. So because of that, they should be ranked third. And opening opposition did well to rebut whatever the arguments came their way. And they did bring in some good constructive arguments. They should be ranked first. Closing government also did well. In fact, they did construct the arguments really well. What they introduced, what were missing from the opening government and all that, and they did identify the clash points were better. But in terms of speaker scores, let's say the opening opposition people have done a slightly better job. So in that case, Australia would be first, France would be second, USA would be third, and Britain would be fourth. That is the way that you do the ranking here. Okay. So now going back to the verdict, I want to mention something important. Now, since there are 4 teams involved, you need to keep in mind that normally when you have like a bench of judges, like when you have like a chair and like 2 panelists, so like a chair and a couple of trainee judges, normally what happens is sometimes you get split judgments, right? Sometimes like you get 2-1, unless you go unanimous, you get split judgments. Like you have one person giving it to the gov, one person giving it to the op, and the chair gives it to op, and it's a 2-1 opposition win. In this case, you can't do that. Okay, because if there are 3 judges on the bench, it's a matter of different people having different verdicts, right? It's like a combination. One person has given first to France, second to USA, third to Australia, fourth to Britain. Another person has given first to Australia, second to France, third to USA, fourth to Britain. Another person has given first to USA, second to Australia, third to Britain, and fourth to France. Can happen, right? People sort of like do different kinds of judgments. So what basically happens is the judges need to sort of like discuss and come to an agreement. Judges need to discuss and come to a final agreement. So that post session where the adjudicators sort of have like a private chat, it takes a little while than an Asian parliamentary debate, because that you need to come to common ground. You're not allowed to go with a split judgment. You can't go with a split judgment because it's messy then, right? So they have to come to a certain agreement. And normally what happens is, if you can come to a verdict, like if 3 people will be like, okay, are we true that we have given first place to like different teams, but I feel like like let's say that I have given first place to Australia, another person has given it to France, another person has given it to US, right? So I'd be like, I feel like that USA was slightly better and my reasoning was better. So the other two would compromise and be like, okay, we'll go with your decision. Like that, right? Normally in this case, the chair sort of like has an edge because like the chair is an experienced person. Doesn't have to be the case. It's not a mandatory rule that the panelists or the trainees should like compromise and they should like take the chair's decision. Most of the cases, like the chair is the chair for a reason, right? That's a case. But if they don't agree that this thing that they can do, they can actually uh, put the scores together and check the average. They can just add their scores, the scores they've given to each team, divide it by 3 and get an average, and then rank the 4 teams. That's also possible, right? And if not, they can just add the positions and divide it. Now, for example, if I have given France first, if these panelists have given France second, and if these panelists have given France third, that means 1 plus 2 plus 3, right? I've given first place number 1, plus this person have given second place 2, 1 plus 2 is 3. This person has given the third position. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. And 6 you divided by 3, the number of people, and you get 2. So second position. That also you can do, right? You can write the number of positions like that, take the average, and sort of like see who has the lowest rank, lowest in the sense like the highest rank, the lowest number. Okay, I'll just explain it a little later if that's confusing. But basically, I think you can understand you need to talk and come to a mutual decision. You can't go with that. When you are giving the feedback, uh, it's optional. In some tournaments, they allow you to tell you that according to my verdict, I rank these guys first, these guys second, these guys third, these guys fourth, and then we had to come to like an agreement. And because of that, this is why the final rankings stand like this. And you can reason it out. Or as in some tournaments, they don't really allow it. You are just supposed to give your feedback. Or you just have to say that the opening government did not bring in good content. The closing government did all the work for the government side. Opposition, opening opposition missed rebutting this point. It was rebutted by the closing opposition. Opening opposition did rebut this point, but the closing government had a stronger rebuttal, and all that you can give your verdict. You can say that the closing government sort of knifed what their own opening opposition said, so I have penalized them for that, and all that, So and so you can explain the reasoning behind your verdict. Okay. And the other easiest option you can do is just giving like a one-person adjudicator. In that case, his ranking goes. If you're going with 3 adjudicators, you can't really go with split judgments. The judges will have to discuss and come to an agreement. But in most cases, trust me on this, most cases, it's quite obvious. It's very unlikely that they would have like a drastically different ranking. You are not going to have me ranking a certain team first and some other adjudicator ranking that team fourth, right? So most cases, the team I ranked first would be ranked by second by another adjudicator. Very unlikely to happen that some team would be ranked third when I ranked them first, and it's extremely unlikely that someone would rank that the last, like the worst team. Right? So the judges disparities happens quite rarely, so it's not that complicated as it sounds. I'm just giving you all the possible ways that the judges can come to the same point, right? And another important obvious fact, there's no motion ranking system happening here, because when you have 4 teams, you can't really have that one team vetoing the motion and all that. It doesn't really work here. You basically give one motion, and the 4 teams prep alone. The opening government should think of 2 main arguments that they should come up with, and all the important things that they should say without leaving much for the closing government. Opening opposition, same. They should think of the main argument the opening government would bring. They would want to rebut that, because they don't want to leave some of the rebuttals for their closing opposition. Also, they need to think of constructive arguments for themselves, 2 arguments, not leaving too much for the closing. Right? The closing government will have to prep for, like, they need to assume what the opening government would say and be ready to extend it to next level. And they need to think of a third argument. What can we bring in as an extra argument? What wouldn't the opening government say? And they need to rebut whatever the standing points. And then when it comes to the closing opposition, it goes the same way, right? So in this case, going closing government or closing opposition sounds a little, what do you call that? A little difficult. It may sound a little difficult to you because basically that your team, technically your teammates in the government, you don't know what they're prepping for when you're supposed to sort of like outshine them. It might appear difficult, but in reality that you have so much time during the debate to prepare, right? Especially if you're going as a whip speaker, right? If you're going as a government whip, you have 6 people speaking for 7 or 8 minutes and you have time to prepare a speech. If you're going as a closing opposition, you have 7 people speaking before you and you have plenty of time to prepare a speech. So it's not that difficult. It's basically all 4 positions are equally easy or equally difficult as the way you see it. All right. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comment section or just contact me personally. I hope this clears things out. And I will see you guys soon.